Thank you, Jonathan, for that beautiful special music. It was really nice. And did you write that or made it in 2 days? Okay. He was saying it was raining, and so he just kind of followed the energy of that. So I feel you on those rainy days. Sometimes, if I had that gift, I would be making music too on rainy days. This morning, as we get started with this time of the sermon, this week I've been reflecting. I don't know why, but I've been reflecting on things that are happening in our world around us. How many of you have noticed things that are just happening around us? And you start to wonder, what's going to happen soon? What's going to take place? We have a message in our Adventist church regarding, the soon coming of Jesus. Matthew 24 lays out all these other things, these things that will take place before Jesus comes again. And we'll have this opportunity to hear that message again. But as I was reflecting on that, I was reflecting on and praying and asking God, what is a message for us today during these uncertain times? And there's a story that came to mind that I believe is an answer to how to live during these days. And that's the story of Esther. I believe the story of Esther is not just a beautiful story tucked away in the Old Testament. It's a reminder, a powerful one, that God is still calling people to serve Him tomorrow, the next day, next month, after the laws change. No, to serve Him right now, in this season, in these days, in a time like this. Because let's be honest, if we're honest, life feels like it's shifting underneath us, doesn't it? Morals are changing before our eyes, and it has been happening for many years, but as they keep changing slowly, we keep adapting to those changes, and we don't see them very often. Truth feels more like negotiating with the person. People say, what is true for you is not true for me. And there can be arguments back and forth, but very less and less people are going to the Bibles to see what is true to God and not true to us. Laws are constantly changing, limiting us to certain rights and certain freedoms that we have personally, and also freedoms that we have within our families. And I'm not going to get into those little details. People are divided, or are becoming more divided, anxious and exhausted. And in the middle of all this shifting culture, these growing questions, personal uncertainty, there may be people who are asking and wondering, what does it mean to be faithful today? Today, now that we're a lot closer than Jesus' second coming. How do I live for God when everything around me is changing? Is there still a place for faith, courage, and obedience in times like these? And that's where Esther's story comes in. It's a very short story, and it's also a powerful story that even in the Jewish culture, they read this story on a certain day, twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening. But we're not going to be reading it twice today. We're just going to be going over it. But I encourage you guys to go through it. It's a very powerful story because she lived in uncertain times. And through her life, we see how God still works, still calls, and still uses people for such a time like this. So what does it mean to be faithful today? And there's 3 things that we're going to be learning from this story. 3 things that reminds us of that journey of faithfulness during difficult or uncertain times. And it often begins in the quiet, in the background, in the season where it feels like nothing significant is happening. And before Esther ever stepped into a palace or risked her life before a king, God was doing something sacred in her life. He was preparing her for such a time like this. Before we begin, let's have a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, as we enter into the story of Esther, the account of Esther that you have given us in your scriptures, help us to learn and be reminded of these principles that have prepared us for such a time like this. And help us, Lord, to find what this time for us looks like, especially during these times that are constantly changing. What does that look like in our life? But even more so, help us to draw closer to you, knowing that you're a God that loves us and wants the best for us. We ask in Jesus' name, amen. One principle that you can learn from the story of Esther is that God shapes us in hidden places. We must remember that God shapes us in hidden places. You know, Esther's journey begins quietly. She's not in the spotlight. She's not even seen as important by the world around her, but God is already at work. While others saw this poor young girl, this quiet, meek girl, God saw a queen that was in the making. Before Esther even wore her crown, she walked through pain. In fact, when the story is read about Esther, we learn that Esther loses her parents early on in her life. And Mordecai, which is her cousin, ends up being the father for her, ends up raising her. And yet, out of all these challenges that Esther faced, this is where God began to shape her. And keep in mind that this was during the time of the exile. This was the time when the enemy had already conquered the Israelites and took some of the people out into different cities, and God's people were scattered, so she wasn't in her home. She didn't have her parents. She was raised up in a society where people did not really like the Jews. And so she had everything against her. Yet God works in her life. For those that like history, this was during the time of in the times of Ezra and Nehemiah, and specifically, Esther's story takes place between chapters 6 and 7 of Ezra. So if you ever read Ezra, her story takes place between chapters 6 and 7, and so she was around that time. She was an orphan, and that's what she faced. Yet she was not abandoned. She was forgotten by the world, yet she was remembered by God. And so let that speak to our hearts. God does his deepest work in your darkest seasons. Before he positions people publicly, he works in people privately. Imagine a diamond. Do you know how a diamond is formed? It doesn't just come out of thin air. It's not just made out of material. It begins buried deep underground. It goes through pressure, the pressure of the earth and the minerals. Then when it's discovered, it's chiseled and refined before it even sparkles. Esther's years of quietness, of quiet obedience, learning humility, navigating grief, was the pressure that formed her into something beautiful. You know, as human beings, we long for those moments, the palace moments, the attention, the recognition, the breakthrough, but we often resist the private preparation that God uses to shape us for those moments he calls us to. I know as when I was younger, I used to ask God, Lord, I want to learn this, I want to do this, and I would do things to try to get there quickly. try to be, there as a young person, I wanted to be recognized, for doing this and doing that. And when I did that, I rushed my growth. I rushed the preparation, and I ended up failing a lot of the times. And over life, I realized that a lot of those dark seasons that I didn't want to go through were actually seasons that prepared me for such a time like this. Now you may be thinking, I'm not Esther. I'm not in my 20s, standing at the beginning of the road. I've already lived through the hidden seasons. I've raised kids. I have buried loved ones. I've weathered storms. But let me tell you, God is not done with you yet. God may be preparing you not just for personal purpose, but for generational impact. You see, you've walked, for those who have walked through the fire, you've walked through that fire, and others need your wisdom. Your hidden seasons may now become mentorship seasons for any young person that enters into your life today. If you look around you, look at how many young people we have today. And you never know who you'll impact if you choose to be present. Esther had her Mordecai. Young people today need their Mordecai. Somebody steady, wise, and present. Now you may say, I'm not wise. I'm still learning. But all those years of learning have given you jewels of wisdom to share, be able to share with others. There are seeds that others can grow from. I'm reminded of dandelions. Have you ever seen a dandelion grow? Well, this season you may have seen a lot of dandelions, right? And if you look at the color of the leaf, when they begin yellow. And then it only takes like a day or two before those yellow leaves become what color? White, right? And those white, what we call seeds, are powerful. We know how powerful they are because once the wind blows them and they get planted in the ground, what tends to happen? There's more dandelions that grow. The wisdom that God has given you is powerful for our generation to come. And in our society today, there's a disconnect between our older generation and our younger generation because there's way less FaceTime with each other. And I'm not talking about FaceTime on the phone. I'm talking about FaceTime with one another. There's a lot less time spent sharing some of our wisdom, some of our experiences with our young ones so that they don't repeat the things that we have done in our lives. There's a woman I knew in one of our Adventist churches in her 70s who would send out daily Bible texts to younger women. She didn't preach from the pulpit, but she shepherded from her phone. And that's what God can do with a life still willing to be used, to connect with others who we may be an influence. And your influence may be greater in this season than it was in your youth. Esther didn't understand her pain in chapter 2, but by chapter 4, she saw it, that God had been preparing her all along. And that's true of you too and me. No matter your age, whether you're 5, 6, or 99, or 105, your life is still being shaped for such a time like this. And Esther, the moment came during a time when God placed her in a position of a queen. A crisis broke out. An evil man named Haman had plotted to wipe out her people, the Jews. And through Esther, even though Esther was queen, her position couldn't shield her from the reality because she was one of them. And suddenly, the hidden girl in the palace had a burden that she could not ignore. And this was her hinge moment where preparation meets purpose. This is where we move from quiet growth to courageous obedience. And when God prepares us, there's a time when God will call us to courageous obedience. Faithfulness today means obeying even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's risky or unclear. Because God's purpose is always bigger than our fear. God's purpose for us is always bigger than the things that are happening around us. We may not stop the laws that are changing. We may not stop the times and how they're turning out to be, but we can take a stand and take a step of courage in the path of God's plans for us. Esther could have stayed silent. She was the queen. She had status, she had comfort, she had security. She could have blended in and protected herself. And let's be honest, it would have been easy for her to be silent when the truth is costly. But Mordecai did not let her be silent. In fact, in Esther chapter 4, verse 14, he tells her, "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish." And then he asks this question, "And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this?" In other words, he's telling her, don't think that you'll escape, and who knows, but that you have come to this kingdom for such a time as this. All of Esther's, when you see the part before chapter 4 and you see her life, all Esther's quiet years were preparing her for this moment. The moment every believer eventually faces is, will I stay quiet or will I speak up? Will I stay safe or will I trust God with the risk of stepping up, standing up? And Mordecai's message to her was clear and powerful. This was Esther's crisis of purpose. She could stay quiet and remain safe, or she can risk everything and trust God. And what did Esther choose? Esther chose courage. But she chose courage not because she wasn't afraid, but because she believed her life belonged to something greater than her comfort. Can you imagine that, standing in front of a king who, if you stepped out of line, could have killed you right on the spot by his soldiers, his guards? But she chose courage. And it's important for us to remember that courage is not the absence of fear. Some of us believe that in order for me to be courageous, I have to get rid of my fear and be able to be firm and move forward. No, courage is not the absence of fear. In fact, a lot of courageous people who take courageous stands for things have fear. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's the decision to act anyways because you trust God more than your fear. What do you fear? What are some fears in your life about what's going on around us? Are you fearing those things that are going on around us, or are you fearing God? Because no matter what happens, I believe God is still in control. And because of that, I can fear God who is in control more than fearing those things that are happening around us. We may have some changes in certain leaderships around the world, but there's nothing to fear except God who is in control. There may be certain laws that are changing, but there's nothing to fear except God who is in control. He's in charge. Esther chose courage, not because she wasn't afraid, but she knew that God was in control. Some of you may not be in a palace, or maybe of you guys, anybody in a palace status? Not lately? Okay. But you're in a position of influence. You're in a position of influence at work, with your friends, some of our younger ones at school. And you don't need royal robes to speak life or to take a stand for what is right. God is calling you to take courage right now where you are. Maybe it's standing for your faith when it's unpopular. Maybe it's refusing to go along with peer pressure and to speak up about some of the things that are not good. Sharing your story of how Jesus has changed you. All those are things that God may be calling you to. And your courage still matters and may be more influential now than ever. Again, some may think, well, I've already served. Let the younger ones lead. But Esther's moment came after her preparation and not before. The decades you live can now become decades of bold witnessing. For some who have lived a life experience, God may be calling you to mentor someone younger. Speak truth in a church matter. Start something new that others are too afraid to, and help them to learn how to lead. Share your testimony. Yes, the whole testimony. A lot of us who have gone through different hardships, once we're done with those hardships, there's a tendency to kind of move beyond them and not go back to them and not tell those stories. But again, if we keep some of those stories away from our young people, and those stories can benefit them as they're gaining experiences, then those stories can make a big impact. I've always enjoyed, growing up, listening to my elders. And elders doesn't mean that, old. It can be anybody that's older than you that has wisdom. And it's through those stories of my elders, and it's not a leadership position, but people who had wisdom. Those were stories that helped me along the way to keep me from making decisions that I would regret later. Nowadays, I don't hear those stories. People don't share them. And maybe it's because there's a fear of looking different if they share those stories, the fears of being rejected. But you've lived those stories, and behind each of those stories, there's a person named Jesus who helped you get through them. There's a person named Jesus who helped you to overcome those challenges. And it's those stories of Jesus that will help our generation know that no matter what they go through, they can rely on Him to get through hardship. I'm a firm believer that, and will always be, that as long as God gives us breath of life, God can use us to make an impact. There's a 65-year-old woman in a small town who felt burdened to pray for the youth in her church. And she started with a list of names and prayed every morning. Then she started writing each one a birthday card with a verse. And over time, teens began reaching out to her. One eventually said, "You were the only one who saw me." She didn't save a nation like Esther, but she changed a generation. And that's courage. Because at first she thought, well, if I write a card, will it make a difference? But she stood out in faith, started writing cards, praying for the young people, and she changed a generation. How many people have changed your lives because they prayed for you? I know my life has been changed because I knew of somebody who prayed for me, who were adults. And it may seem like a simple thing, but it makes a big difference. God has prepared us for such a time like this. Esther didn't perish. She took courage, and because of her courage, a nation was saved. The last principle that we can learn from the story is that God uses us, ordinary people, for extraordinary impact. Esther didn't have a prophetic calling. She wasn't a priest or a prophet. She was a young woman raised by her cousin, navigating through the life of exile and brokenness, yet God used her to save a nation. And that's the beauty of the gospel. God doesn't need perfect people. He uses people who are willing to be used by him. And the book of Esther does not end with tragedy. It ends with triumph. After all the fasting, all the courage, after the risk, God turned the story around. In fact, in Esther chapter 8, 16 and 17, it tells us for the Jews, there was a light and gladness and joy and honor. In each and every province, in each and every city, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a celebration. There was, God turned the story around, and there was joy, there was gladness. And when you look back at the story, Esther didn't do a miracle. She didn't call down fire from the sky. She didn't split a sea. She simply made herself available, and God did the rest. This is what's so extraordinary about her story. She was an ordinary woman with the heart to trust God in extraordinary ways. You know, some of us disqualify ourselves too quickly. The other day I was listening to a colleague, and he was saying, you know, I'm not good at doing this and doing that, and he didn't realize that he's disqualifying himself for something that only God qualifies us to. Right? He's classifying himself on what he believes is a good leader in these certain areas. I haven't told him yet, but I'm going to have to call him here soon and tell him, hey, you were a little hard on yourself. Because God has prepared us for such a time like this, and he has given us talents that through him, God can use no matter who you are. But we disqualify ourselves sometimes too quickly. We think sometimes, I'm too young. You remember those moments? Some of you guys are in that moment. I'm not trained enough. I don't speak well. I've made too many mistakes. I'm too old now. It's too late. And you might feel like your time has passed, or your moment's not right now, or your influence is not like it used to be. But I can tell you something today, that you're not done. God is still calling you for such a time like this. There's a quiet church member who felt he had no skills or talent. He never preached, he never led a committee, but every week he stood at the door, shook hands, smiled at every single person, especially the kids. And one day, a 25-year-old man who had walked away from the church comes back. And when asked why, he said, because I remember how Mr. James always made me feel seen. You never know how God is going to use you when you step out in courage to do something to serve God and to make an impact on other people. A young girl in exile, he used her, like Esther. A shepherd boy named David, he used him. A lunchbox with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, he used that too. Don't wait until you feel ready. God can use you now. Start small. You can offer to pray for a friend. You can volunteer and help in community services, either here or in your community. Be kind when others are cruel. Your faithfulness with the help of the Holy Spirit will lead you to make an impact around you. You know, Esther's legacy outlived her life. So can yours. And the season of life isn't for slowing down. It's for pouring out. Pouring out wisdom, pouring out prayer, pouring out love on people who feel forgotten Our time is not yesterday. Our time is now. You remember Anna, the prophetess in Luke 2? She was in her 80s, worshiping, fasting, praying at the temple, and she saw Jesus before she died, and her faithfulness became part of the redemption story that we still read. God isn't looking for famous people. He's looking for ordinary people like you and I who have an open heart to be used by God in such a time like this. Amen. And if you say, Lord, here I am, use me, he will, just like he used Esther. You may not see your name in headlines, but if your name is written, it will be written in heaven. God is still writing a history, writing your story, and your story has simply just began. So what about you? What do we learn from this? That God shapes us, that our journey, that God is taking us to faithfulness, comes from one that is shaped in the hidden places. Our journey for such a time like this is one where God calls us out to courageous obedience, where he calls us out and he says, go. And our journey is one where God uses ordinary people for extraordinary impact. And yes, that includes you. Esther didn't have all the answers. She didn't know the king, how he would respond. She didn't have a guarantee that her courage would be rewarded. But she had something more powerful than certainty. She had a heart that surrendered to God. And she offered her life for God's purpose. And through that surrender, a generation was saved. People were saved. You and I may not be called for a throne room, but we're called to places where God has planted us. In our homes, in our churches, in our neighborhoods, even in our pain and limitation. What would happen if we were to be like Esther and say, if I perish, but I will still follow God? What if we simply said, Lord, here I am, use me, no matter the age, no matter the background, no matter your mistakes, use me. God is still writing your story for such a time like this. And no matter what we may be facing or what we will be facing, God is calling us out for such a time like this. When I look at the news, and I'll finish with this, my focus is not so much what's going to happen to me, but what can I do to be ready to help people when that happens? Does that make sense? What could I do? And it's not something I can answer on my own. I come to prayer and ask, Lord, what can I do when that happens, when that takes place? If this law were to be implemented, Lord, how can you use me? Where can you use me so I can take a stand and help people who are going to be in need? God is calling us for such a time like this. When we face news about changes that are going on in the conference, it can be easy to look at some of those changes. And again, I'll be learning with you guys on what some of those changes are, but it could be easy to think about, what are they doing for us? But our mentality should be, what can I do for the Lord? Yeah. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And it's the same with the church. Ask not what the church can do for you, but what you can do for the church, for God's church. Because this church is God's church, and He's invited me to become part of this family. And so I treat this church as though it's my own home, right? Even better, let's put it that way, than my own home. And everything that's going around and the ministries that are happening, I treat it as my ministries, right? And the plans that are brought, changes that are made, I don't treat it as that's their changes. I treat it like this. These are our plans. Because God has prepared us for such a time like this. As we close, I want to close with this hymn, Be Thou My Vision. And I want to close with that hymn because I want that hymn to be our God's calling to you. Will you stand up? As you're thinking, God is calling us and asking us, will you stand up with me in these times? Will you stand up with me during these changes that are taking place? Will you take courage? Would you take me and allow you to lead you so that you can lead my people, my country in such a time like this? May this not only be a calling to us, this hymn, but may it also be a prayer that we have every day. Be thou my vision.
Pastor, this is the one we were given.
The hymn, Be Thou My Vision, is hymn 547. And it was the wrong number on 547.
Yeah, 547. Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart, not be all else to